This was really devastating to our national sense of cybersecurity. We don't yet know what the Russian actors took. We don't yet know what their ultimate purpose was.
Welcome to the RANE Insights podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. The SolarWinds breach hit thousands of public and private organizations and individuals. Many of the details and consequences of the breach remain unknown. A recent revelation that Chinese hackers may have piggybacked onto the initial Russian incursion shows just how prevalent state-sponsored cyber espionage has become. In this podcast, RANE founder David Lawrence speaks with Robert Kanacki, a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations who also served as Director for Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council. They talk about new details of the breach, lessons learned, and processes that must change to ensure digital information is protected. Let's listen.
Rob, first of all, a great privilege and honor to be able to sit down with you and talk about the broad issue of cybersecurity in the most recent SolarWinds breach. And again, I want to tell you it was a absolutely great article that you wrote for Foreign Affairs, and we'll link it to this podcast. Maybe I can begin by first setting the table and asking you sort of broadly how we should be thinking about the threat to national security and national economy that now exists within our sort of digital world, and just sort of how you are generally looking at the issues of cyber threats, cybersecurity, the actors who are behind it, and not only what has occurred and is occurring, but what is likely to occur.
Sure. So let me begin with SolarWinds and how I've kind of reacted to that. And my basic take is that this was really devastating to our national sense of cybersecurity. We don't yet know what the Russian actors took. We don't yet know what their ultimate purpose was. What we do know is that they were able to exploit our software supply chain. They were able to do that to infect as many as 18,000 SolarWinds customers. And they were able to actively exploit 400 of those customers. That included federal agencies, large commercial enterprises, and other security tool makers. And that they were able to do this for at least 7 months and possibly far longer. And in the end, the only way we know about this, the only way we caught them, was because FireEye had a smart person working in their security operations center who investigated a false alarm on multi-factor authentication that had been tripped, I believe, inadvertently by the attacker, right? And so what does that mean, right? It means that this group, the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Unit, was able to evade the best detection tools we've got out there from companies like CrowdStrike and FireEye and others. They were able to maintain their access without tripping over honeypots or other deception technologies deployed by these companies. They were able to act in such a way that they didn't stand out to tools that are looking for anomalous activity. And then I think almost worst of all, they were able to, for this entire period, hide what they were doing from the US intelligence community, who found out about this activity from FireEye, not from their signals collection, not from what they are doing on an offensive basis on foreign networks. And so all in all, the idea that we've been getting better at cybersecurity really was kind of knocked apart by this incident.
So it's a great overview, and as you noted in your article, sort of a wake-up call. And also what you've just highlighted is it was almost, I don't want to call it accidental or fortuitous or serendipitous, that we even found out about it, and but for the work of one person, not because of technology, not because of the overall security net that we have around our digital infrastructure, this would have continued. And so, what is the message, Rob, that comes out of this moment? What are the lessons that we need to take away?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple. One, let me start, with the U.S. government. Right, there's been a major focus on using offense for defensive purposes. What the Department of Defense calls defend forward or persistent engagement. The idea that we can use offensive cyber operations to protect our networks. The idea that we can go off of U.S. networks and fight the adversary on their networks, that we could get into and disrupt these operations at their source rather than relying on security controls at destination. Now, it's a good theory and I've been supportive of it, but the reality is you can't fight what you can't see. And we weren't able to in this 7 months, when in a period under which Russian cyber activity was under deep scrutiny. I mean, let's not forget that the alleged actor here, the SVR, also was involved in reconnaissance operations, at least in 2016 against the DNC. And so while we're watching the Russians for engaging in election interference, and in many ways, and I think justifiably, patting ourselves on the back for protecting the election, we apparently had no idea what at least one very large part of Russia's foreign intelligence collection operation was doing, which was this whole campaign. I mean, there's a number, and I don't believe it. I think it's been exaggerated, but allegedly the U.S. intelligence community has concluded that up to 1,000 individuals were involved on the Russian side in carrying out this campaign, in targeting all these companies and developing the malware and conducting reconnaissance, which is a massive operation. And so the fact that the U.S. intelligence community missed it, and therefore that Cyber Command wasn't able to disrupt it, is really problematic. So I think there is something that needs to be looked at, and a question needs to be made: is it a matter of resources, right, or is this just too hard? Are these targets going to be too hard for our offensive operations to compromise them? That's the first thing. Now, the second piece, I've hit the tool makers pretty hard here. Right? I don't blame FireEye for failing to detect this, that any of their detection engines failed to trip this, right? Adversaries are going to test their tools against detection engines and detection tools. That's what any smart offensive operator would do. We see that clearly in this case, where they looked for every single EDR agent, every single endpoint agent that was common to the market, and seen whether they were detecting their activity. And if they were, the agent, the Russian agent, was doing something pretty smart, right? It was saying, okay, if we can disable this detection engine, we'll do that, and then we'll go on our merry way. And if we can't, we'll just shut down, right? If we're going to be detected, and the detection by an EDR agent is going to bring this whole thing down on us, we'll just stop the activity. And so that's what they'd written into the code, right? And so it's going to be very hard for some tool makers to detect these things. The piece that I've really hit them on is the fact that at least one tool maker, Palo Alto Networks, is claiming that they in fact did detect this activity, and that they stopped it, no harm came to them, and that they detected the activity using one of their tools, and they generated indicators of compromise from what they detected, and they shared those with their customer to protect their customers. And that's great, and that's good if you're a Palo Alto customer. The problem is they didn't share that with anybody else. They didn't share that with the Department of Homeland Security, who could have shared it with the intelligence community. They didn't share it with the Cyber Threat Alliance, an organization they stood up for the express purpose of sharing this kind of information. And so nobody else knew. And so we ended up in a situation when it took FireEye losing very valuable pieces of their IP to figure this out and then to inform the rest of the community about it. And so, that's a key piece here. We've got to figure out how we get these security tool makers who are competitors to be working together in a cooperative manner. So we've got kind of a national detection grid, and failure of one tool at one company doesn't mean that we end up in a situation like this, where this activity can go on for so long. And then I think the last and final piece, and this is kind of the hardest to unpack, is really the supply chain one. How do you know if you can trust your suppliers of software, particularly of crucial software like SolarWinds? I think there's a couple pieces here that are troubling. One is I think there's a fair amount of evidence that SolarWinds really didn't take security very seriously. They didn't have a CISO. They didn't invest in it, even though they started to try and take over the commercial space in this area and were advertising as a security tool and stood up an MSSP. They didn't invest a lot in their own security. And so, they were a very easy target, it would appear, easier than competitors in the field for carrying out this kind of activity. Well, how do you know that, and how do you factor that in? I think security ratings are potentially a piece of this. Companies that I advise, like Security Scorecard, BitSight, competitors, they are able to rate companies on their security, at least on an outward level. That's a piece of this. The harder piece of this is really how you evaluate the security of the software that you've purchased. It's one thing to rate the website security of the company. It's another thing to be able to really know, was this software built securely? Does it have vulnerabilities in it? Is it more likely to have more vulnerabilities than competitor software? Is it using good security hygiene, good security practices in the build? These are things that are very difficult to rate and very difficult to get those evaluations out publicly. In fact, every software license ever written will protect against that. And so that's, I think, the last piece that we need to tackle here, is to figure out how we can gain more trust in our software supply chain.
So you've highlighted a number of vulnerabilities. One is we haven't yet reached the inflection point of having truly a cooperative net here amongst the private sector. And also what we hear, and you probably hear this as well constantly from the private sector, is that the government doesn't share enough with the private sector to sort of know what they know. Have you encountered that particular issue, and how do you begin to break that this stalemate?
So, I think on the issue of government knowledge, there's two pieces to it. One, the federal government has been pretty clear that it did not have intelligence on this threat, that it wasn't sitting on it and didn't share it. And in fact, since I was in government in 2014, right, we put in place policy that's still in place today, that when the federal government knows that you've been a victim or the target of a sophisticated campaign like this, they will inform you. And the FBI has made thousands of such notices to companies in the last few years. So I think in this case, it wasn't that the government didn't have information and didn't share it. It was that the government did not have that information. Now, there's a couple nuances here. One is what people in the intelligence community will refer to as tipping and queuing, right? There's a break between what is detected in the private sector in the United States and what our foreign intelligence entities detect abroad, right? The NSA is not being informed by what's hitting commercial companies. They're not being told, okay, we saw this, we were pinged by this IP address, we're calling out to this domain name, we saw this malware, we collected it, we're passing it to you for evaluation to figure out whether you can do any targeting on that basis to help inform us. The processes for this, they're not just broken, the links are broken, they don't exist. And so we don't have the ability to work in that coordinated manner between the private sector and the public sector. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to try and fix.
Let me probe a little bit on the issues of attribution, and maybe you can explain for the audience sort of how attribution is assigned, what level of certainty is required, and as reports were surfacing as early as yesterday, there some indication that possibly Chinese actors were involved as well, or maybe in lieu of prior attribution to Russian actors. Can we gain, sort of your perspective, first in terms of how attribution is assigned and how that research continues, and then, in terms of your best perspective of who were the actors behind the SolarWinds breach?
So, I mean, attribution has been something that was almost impossible in the early days of the internet, and has improved really over the last decade. I think the sort of best, earliest public attribution at a detailed level, at least in my mind, was when Mandiant came out. I think this was in 2012 or 13. And outed one of the Chinese APT groups. I believe APT-1 is what they labeled it, and they labeled out their evidence for how they tracked the activity back from their customers back to a building in China. And they had said, look, we can attribute it down to this building, and we can say, there's two possibilities. This is a building of a Chinese intelligence unit, and so it's either the Chinese intelligence that's carrying out these attacks, possible, or they've got a real problem and some other foreign intelligence agency has compromised their networks and is using their infrastructure without them knowing it to carry out this intelligence campaign against our customers, right? And so that's kind of the best early example of how this works. Then if you follow that up, the U.S. government then came out, I think a couple months later, with the indictment of the 5 Chinese PLA hackers, and they took that attribution a step further. They took it down to the individuals, right? They weren't saying it's this unit, they weren't saying it's this hacker handle, they were saying it's this unit, this hacker handle, this person with this name, and this picture. And indicted them in a court outside Pittsburgh. That level of attribution really required, I think in that case, the evidence suggests from what's publicly known, it required the cooperation of the U.S. intelligence community actively targeting those actors. Then you can look at other cases like the hacking of the election in 2016, where I think it's safe to say, based on what's publicly known, that there was some human intelligence involved. That the U.S. Intelligence community was able to get actors who were going to confirm specifics of Vladimir Putin's involvement in that incident. And so that's the sort of full range from what we can infer, what we can understand based on the attacks we're seeing in publicly available information, to active signals intelligence collection, all the way up to human intelligence to make an attribution. Now, in this case, how those attributions come out, they can really differ in the level of certainty and the level of quality and in how they're delivered. In this case, we've had companies that have made the attribution back to the SVR, or groups that are known to be associated with the SVR, based on what they're able to see, what information they're able to collect as victims or as the vendors for victims. As this information got passed into the U.S. government, I think we got what I would understand to be in some cases purposeful, in some cases non-purposeful leaks of attribution confirming that it was in fact the Russians, right? So this is an unusual situation in some ways because we're still trying to grapple with what does attribution mean in terms of what do we have to do about it, right? If we attribute this to the Russians and we say this is the Russians as we now have, right, that invites a need to respond. And the difficulty here for the team that's trying, I think, to put together that response is trying to state to the Russians and to the world what it is the Russians did wrong, when in this case, it looks, at least on the surface, like this was standard intelligence collection, the kind of intelligence operation that is widely accepted under international norms. And so, in some cases, attribution, like we've seen, may box governments in a way that they ultimately will find uncomfortable.
We'll get back to the conversation in just a moment. With in-house expertise and a global network of experts, RANE provides more than 400 corporations, government agencies, and academic institutions with risk intelligence and actionable insights from the collective wisdom of our global network. We provide tools and intelligence to help you efficiently stay ahead of emerging risks in 5 key areas, including geopolitical risk, security and threat intelligence, healthcare, cybersecurity, and of course, legal, regulatory, and compliance. Find out more at ranenetwork.com.
So, Rob, you bring up, let's call it the elephant in the room. And I want to sort of also get into simplifying this issue a little bit. Towards the end of your comments, you just referenced a fundamental point that I think has escaped the broader marketplace. That there is I'll put the term in quotes, there is a game that goes on between nation states in terms of what falls within acceptable norms for purposes of intelligence gathering, espionage, and possible disinformation campaigns, also disruption of operations, economic platforms, etc. And what you seem to be suggesting is that possibly one of the reasons we're at this point of increasing cyber warfare is that there are nation states that are sort of doing what they've always done in terms of objectives. And so there's no real recourse. And the metaphor I've sometimes used is the big boys are bowling, and you have a lot of companies and a lot of consumers and a lot of what I'll refer to as enterprises and institutions, including government agencies themselves, that are the bowling pins in this sort of game where the gods are bowling. And am I sort of understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting analogy. I think it's one that a lot of companies like Microsoft and others would agree with, right? We're just sort of victims here. We're commercial enterprises, we're businesses, and in some cases, our customers, in some cases, the countries that we develop software for, we develop software in, are targeting us, right? And this feels, deeply unfair, right? At the same time, I think there's a first very basic question that you have to answer when trying to engage in the question of what's right and what's wrong, right? And it's really down to the level of, do you want to collect intelligence in the 21st century, right? And you could decide, I'm sure there are some countries out there that, say, hey, it's not worth it. It doesn't meet our geopolitical interests. We don't have the resources. We're not going to do spying. Most countries spy, though, and certainly most world powers spy. All world powers spy. And so if you're going to engage in espionage in the 21st century, that's going to take place primarily over computers. And so, given that, the next question is, do we need a sort of different set of rules? I think the U.S. intelligence community has been, for the most part, appropriately constrained itself. There's an awful lot of lawyers mucking up an awful lot of operations, making everybody's life difficult to try and understand what's legal and what's not legal to protect U.S. citizen data, to abide by what we think are reasonable norms to protect the interest of the ecosystem more broadly. I think that's a active effort that's always underway. But what's different in some ways about espionage in the 21st century is just the scale that it allows, right? The potential to get into 18,000 companies, or even just the 400 companies that were actively exploited, right? This is a scale of intelligence, and this is a scale of collection that really is unprecedented, right? If you take up the list of documents that Robert Hansen, the FBI mole, took out, I think over about a decade. I calculated this once, right? He smuggled them out into dead drops in parks around the DC areas. In total, right, this would have been, a couple of megabytes worth of data, right? And we're seeing intelligence collection now that's measured in petabytes. And so the scale of the collection has changed. The other thing that's changed is the risk, right? Okay, we're going to destroy a lot of computers. And I think this is a worthy point to raise, but we're going to destroy a lot of computers as the result of this. It's going to cost us a lot. But those computers, at least at this point, they don't have feelings. They don't have rights. They don't even know that they're at risk, right? Well, Robert Hansen is still in Supermax and he will never get out, right? So spying in the old world came with a lot of risks that introduced natural limitations to both officers and agents that we just don't have in the digital world. And so right now we're kind of in a free-for-all where the response from a lot of the U.S. intelligence community has been to this and other past actions, not bad on them, bad on us, right? Our responsibility was to protect our secrets from them. Their responsibility, their job that they go in every day to do is to get those secrets out of our networks. They didn't do anything wrong. We did something wrong. If we could have done to them what they did to us, we would have done that. And I think right now that represents the norm. The question is, do we need to, in some ways, change that norm?
So apropos of that, a reasonable question might follow, Rob, which is, are we engaged in the same activities with respect to other nation states that they are engaged in with us?
I mean, I think it's safe to say, just based on the comments that we've seen coming out of the intelligence community, that right, this is not behavior that necessarily is beyond the pale. That we haven't articulated a norm in which we say supply chain attacks like this are unacceptable for the following reasons. And you could articulate those reasons, and you could decide to say we wouldn't do it for these reasons. But we haven't done that. People have suggested various rubrics under which you could create those norms, right? You could say, well, the problem with this attack, even if it was only espionage, is that ultimately it will be so costly to the companies that were targeted because they're going to have to spend so much money rebuilding their networks that it effectively was a destructive attack. I mean, that's in some ways a reasonable position, right? The recommendation coming out of NSA and CSET, the Department of Homeland Security, is that if you were compromised in this, you cannot trust your Active Directory. You need to rebuild it from the ground up. That's going to be a very costly exercise. So even if the Russians didn't destroy any technology, they caused its destruction. And so do we want to say, right, the scale of this kind of activity is such that, it is going to ultimately end up having a destructive outcome and therefore shouldn't be accepted? I don't know. I think that's probably a bridge too far when you balance all the interests we have from a national security perspective in collecting intelligence against our adversary. I think probably on balance, national security leaders will conclude, we wouldn't want to constrain ourselves to carry out this kind of activity, even if it means that we will be subject to it.
So you open a very, at least in my mind, a very intriguing door. Okay, and since I spent 10 years in the government, then 20 years at Goldman Sachs, and obviously now at RANE, I tend to think about, and went to law school, Rob, I tend to think about sort of the allocation of costs. And you're suggesting that we may be at a point where we do need to adopt new norms and potentially agree to those norms between nation states, but we may not be at that point. And indeed, on a cost benefit basis, at least if you're the U.S. government, the benefits of maintaining the status quo, and maybe that's the perspective of other nations such as China and Russia, uh, the governmental benefits outweigh the, we'll call it the societal or industry costs. But in the meantime, the companies that are bearing the costs, of course, are private sector companies, but I'd also argue some government agencies. The breach of the personnel records of was significant. Even the ability to access through Equifax, the credit histories of government employees, uh, some benefit. But the costs seem to be borne now principally within the private sector. And that means investors, it's at the cost of how capital gets deployed, potentially at the cost of innovation, et cetera. And as you point out, the recovery here is time consuming, it's costly, obviously it's distracting, and it often will mean a diversion from other opportunities that might be not only beneficial to companies, but beneficial more broadly to our national economy and job creation and things like that. And the question I have here is that are we allocating the costs of cybersecurity and both what I'll refer to as the types of things that companies have to spend money on to prevent a problem, no less to remediate it. Are we allocating it properly in light of who's behind it and what the ultimate purposes are? And I'll give you sort of we'll call it a dramatic point, at least I think it is. You take the company Equifax, which had a incredibly damaging breach and the loss of information that wasn't just theirs to own, but quite frankly belonged to individual consumers. And what resulted were all sorts of regulatory enforcement actions and civil settlements and class actions, and obviously huge amount of reputational damage. There were congressional hearings, there were job resignations, et cetera, et cetera. There was a completely convulsive event, not just for Equifax, but for the marketplace. And the tab was very significant from a monetary, financial, reputational, operational standpoint. And then I think it was a number of years later, whether it was 3 years later, whatever that, I believe the Justice Department brought the indictments of 3 or 4 senior Chinese military officials as the architects and sponsors behind a sophisticated state-sponsored event. And so I think a reasonable takeaway here is if companies are being attacked by sophisticated actors who are able to use some of the most sophisticated technology, and these are state-sponsored events, what has to change so we don't continue this cycle? Because this is not, this can't be on a long-term basis particularly beneficial. And is it fair for corporations to be assuming such a huge part of the costs, burdens, reputational risk, operational disruption costs that they currently are and seem to be increasingly absorbing?
It's one of the tougher questions in this space, and I come down decidedly on one side of it. I think based on our prior conversation so far, it should be pretty clear, right, that the U.S. government does not have a silver bullet here, right? If it did, it would be using that silver bullet at least to protect its own agencies. If it did, if NSA had the solution, it would have been brought out by now, particularly as these incidents get more and more politicized and government is expected to do more. I think if it could, it would. And so, ultimately, the best solution I think we're going to have are companies continuing to take responsibility for their own security and having the incentives, both positive and negative, for them to do that, to invest adequately, to make appropriate decisions on their software and hardware stacks, to make appropriate trade-offs between security and usability. And then I think the big missing piece, to cooperate with the federal government and with other companies in order to detect and rapidly respond and stop these attacks. I think that's really the only solution here. I think the idea of government somehow taking on more responsibility, nobody's come up with a construct for how that would work. And then I think on the economic question of, well, should the companies pay for it or should the government pay for it, right? Well, ultimately, it's the companies and it's their consumers that fill the government's coffers. And so I'm not sure that an indirect method of government funding through tax revenue the security of private companies makes sense. I think we need to get a model in which companies are encouraged to invest adequately in their own security is where we need to end up, and where we're going to end up, and where we're starting to end up. The last point I'll say on Equifax, I took almost an opposite view on this. My view is if you're going to hold that kind of data, you should be putting up a bond for every single record that you're holding, and that record should be payable to the individual whose records you hold in the event that you lose it, right? And that would create market incentives for companies like Equifax to say, we can never lose this data, and if we are at risk of losing this data, then we better not collect this data. That's, I think, the appropriate way to deal with the personal records issue, because you're right? It's not their data, and yet they weren't incentivized to protect it, and they weren't ultimately penalized in any meaningful way for losing it. And so I think we do need a new rubric in this area.
Although if you talk to where you stand on that issue, Rob, depends on where you sit. Equifax feels, I think, very, very much taken to the woodshed and penalized. But that's a separate point than the one that you're appropriately making. And of course, a rebuttal which I have heard, is even the most sophisticated U.S. government agencies have not been able to protect themselves and have lost critical confidential data about their employees. So what chance do we have? And increasingly, I'm sure you're familiar with the question of how fast do you have to be to outrun a bear, and the answer being just faster than the other guy. What has certainly emerged in the marketplace is, at least an effort that where people feel I've built up something, so I will not be the path of least resistance to these attackers, and so maybe there is some safety and security in that paradigm, but obviously that doesn't protect people overall, and the defense being only as strong as the weakest link, I think is really one of the points that you made about SolarWinds and sort of how the penetration occurred and how it was able to survive and live anonymously as long as it did. So just in the remaining time that we have, I'd like to maybe, and you've emphasized a few things, possibly the need to think about and adopt new norms in the activity between countries. Certainly the responsibility that each company has to think through what they hold and how they hold it and the security around that. The importance of cooperation within the private sector and between the private and public sector. And again, as you said, no silver bullets. But I'd actually like to let's go back a number of decades and get into a more analog world where, as you said, what has changed here is the ability to launch these, we'll call it data gathering. And I'm glad you brought up Hansen, and I could talk about moles that were within the CIA and the damage they did. And you could even talk about Snowden and his activities. But the point you're making is that the ability to work remotely, anonymously, I'll argue very cheaply with low barriers of entry, um, high reward, low risk activity, and of course the ability to scale is what makes these moments different. Um, and if you think about what's been occurring, I like to in these conversations reference that the underlying crimes, to think about this as a technology problem in search of a technology solution, may be missing the broader point, and the broader point may be about new norms. But if you look at the crimes that are being committed, whether it's theft, fraud, extortion, blackmail, espionage, sabotage, disinformation, all those, we'll call them, all those crimes actually go back to the days of the Bible. What hasn't happened, as you said, is the ability to launch these things and with such scale and I'll call it effectiveness through our new portals. Is it time, and you seem to be alluding to this a little bit, in terms of Equifax and the information they gather, is it time to rethink what it is we actually hold on our digital platforms? And I'm also inferring from your early comments in this podcast that to date we don't always know why people are interested in some of this information or what their ultimate goal is. But it does feel like there's this ultimate, I was going to say, Hoover vacuum, let's call it a Dyson vacuum effort, just to gather as much as they can, wherever they can, and then maybe figure out the business model, I put that term in quotes, behind that. But is it time for us to start really rethinking what information is held on the digital platforms, to think about this in analog terms about the crimes that are being committed, why they're being committed, whether it's organized crime, hacktivists, state sponsors. Again, these types of actors go back to the days of the Bible. And, begin to rethink sort of what we're holding and how we're holding it in light of the fact that with SolarWinds, it's yet, as you said, a humbling moment where we thought we had things reasonably under control until we didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a lot of companies, we need to create the incentives for them to rethink why they're holding data and why they're collecting data. And we need to rethink, I think, on some fundamental levels, the economics of data markets and who owns data and what they get to do with it. I'm encouraged to see, I think, the start of a movement away from advertising as the only way that online content and online services can be created and delivered. I got really excited a couple months ago when Google told me that my Gmail account was reaching the upper limits, and that I would have to pay money if I wanted to have more storage. And that was a really exciting moment, right? Because it was Google actually saying, "Hey, we'll charge you $3 a month to give you a whole bunch of storage." I said, "Great, right? This is very different than you tapping all my information that you collect on me to target ads at me, right? Can I pay you more money not
But
to do
Rob,
that?"
they didn't say we're going to charge you in lieu of that model. They're saying we're going to charge you on top of that model.
On top of that, right? But I mean, for Google, this was I think on the consumer level, a huge move, right? I'm waiting for the day when Facebook says Facebook will not always be free, right? I mean, this is Mark Zuckerberg's line. Facebook, will always be free. Well, it's not free, right? It's the old adage, right? If something's free online to you, you're not the consumer, you're the product, right? They're selling your data, they're harvesting your data, and they're targeting ads at you with that data, even if they're not reselling that data to a data broker, right? They're using that to manipulate you into spending money you don't want to spend. And so, I think if we can find other business models like Google is now doing with storage, like I hope they may do with Gmail, and then others may follow, where you can get an incredible service that can be offered at scale very cheaply, but not free. I think we're all going to be better off than trying to harvest every detail of your life on and offline in order to monetize it to support platforms. I think that's a dangerous space. And so, I'd like to see more restrictions on the collection of data. I'd like to see smarter models for the collection of that data. I've been making a big push on identity, where I think that there is the potential for identity providers to come in and resolve the need to collect a lot of this information, right? You don't need my birth date to know I'm over the age of 21. You just need somebody to validate that I'm over the age of 21. My exact birth date should not matter for almost anything I'm doing online. And so I think there's a big potential here for new markets to be developed if we're willing to put in place some restrictions on the way we're doing business today.
Okay, that's a great point. And just last few minutes in closing, I want to tease out another idea from your comments, which is from a risk-benefit analysis as we continue to launch new products, and the axiom, if a product is free, you're the product. The question of whether, as we launch new products, new services, etc., into the marketplace, what appears to also happen is that the long-term or back-end potential costs, and let's just focus on data and privacy and how data is protected and what can be breached, that not enough analysis is going into what products can be launched into the market and how and when, what can be sold to the public. Obviously, a lot of very personal health and medical information is now being stored online, and a day barely goes by when you don't hear about a breach that potentially impacts the health and medical community. And there was a time, and that's why I want to go back to the analog days, where as more electronic products were coming onto market, there were certain fire safety issues. There were issues about whether plugging a device into your electrical outlets might, cause a fire, or in the old days, fuses to blow out, or something could overheat while you were sleeping at night, and things like that. And a testing service developed, which was, I guess, this goes back to the DNA of NIST standards around various cyber products and security protocols, called Underwriters Laboratory, which was actually certifying the safety of products, and that they, and to provide confidence for consumers. And I heard you earlier in our broadcast referencing sort of a certification process where, whether it's around the security protocols that a company might be putting in place, or maybe it's the safety and security of specific products coming to market, the privacy safeguards. And obviously there have been some announcements by Apple and now Facebook concerning what I'll refer to as consumer data protection. And I'd love to get your thoughts, because it feels like it is overdue for consumers to be able to have an Underwriters Lab type of certification concerning either the products they're buying, the services they're signing up for, the what I'll refer to as agreements that they enter into with various providers, whether it's healthcare, whether it's their academic institutions, where they do have a certification of safety and security. And I'd love, just in the closing here, to get your thoughts on that, and as well as how something like that might be established and take on, the role that that little UL seal has taken on with virtually every piece of electronics that we purchase.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting space. I remember it may have been 5 or more years ago, Underwriters Laboratory said they were going to make a big push into the space. And I honestly don't know what came of it, but I think it's safe to say it hasn't had the impact in that time that they might have hoped and that we might have hoped, since we're having this conversation right now. There's any number of certifications that companies can put on their website to say they're meeting various standards. I mean, I think the real issue is, are those standards meaningful, and what level of protection do they really provide, and how much assurance should you have if a company you're doing business with has one of them. I've been a big supporter of work of the cyber ITL, which is a lab that was set up for rating the software security of products. I think that's a very important metric, and they've done some work with consumer reports to include those ratings in their evaluation. So I think it's coming, but overall, how we measure security and whether those measurements are meaningful is still a really developing field. The last point I'll say here is I was really heartened to see in mid-January announcement from Bob Kolaski at CISA at DHS that their National Risk Management Center is going to make a big push on cybermetrics, that they want to help mature that field and mature that capability. And so I'm hoping that kind of government step in along with existing work at NIST can help us really to get to a point where we can measure security in a meaningful and trusted way.
Rob, I can't thank you enough for not only spending time with us, but continuing to speak out and to write in a very, very, what I'll refer to as persuasive and understandable way for publications such as Foreign Affairs, and very much consider it, continuing public service. So thanks in advance, and obviously we're going to link that article to this podcast, and I want to say a conversation to continue. And these insights have been very, very valuable. And clearly, there needs to be a bit of a pause and a rethink about what we're doing and continuing to do, and whether there are a few things here that can make a very, very significant difference. Would it be fair to sort of conclude as follows, Rob, that the current trend is not our friend?
I think that is a very concise way to put it, David.
Okay. Rob, thanks again for truly your public service and your collaborative efforts. And for the audience, we try to find the honest brokers and the people who can actually speak objectively and factually and on an evidence-based fashion. And Rob is certainly one of the leaders in this space. So thanks again, Rob.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Robert Kanacki is the Whitney Shepperson Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and an expert in cybersecurity. Please visit RANEnetwork.com to learn more about the implications of this attack for businesses and individuals, and what steps organizations can take in the days and weeks ahead. Go to RANEnetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.